Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray. I've got a question today from Robert Fisher, which I'll get to in a minute. But of course, you can ask us a question. You can send us a postcard. You can send us an email, comment on a previous video or podcast, and I will attempt to answer your questions because that's what I do. Attempt to answer your questions in 10 minutes. Sometimes I go over, sometimes I go under, mostly over, and attempt to give you a break from the mundane life you lead in the real world and to think about the really important stuff of ancient warfare in the ancient world. Now, you, of course, can back us on Patreon. There's one of 3 levels. You can even get a copy of the magazine. We've got Legionary for $1 a month. No, $1 a month? I'm not sure. $1. Optio for $5, which gives you a digital copy of the magazine, which comes out once every 2 months. And Centurion, which is $10, which gives you a physical copy of the magazine when it comes out. Right. Now, Robert's question is about an article I wrote in Ancient Warfare 17.3 on the Hunnic Siege of Naissus, modern Nis in Serbia. I really enjoyed the article about the Hunnic Siege of Naissus. However, I had a question about the Hunnic siege engines described and illustrated in the article. They look like proto-trebuchets with mantlets to protect the crew, and instead of a counterweight or pulleys, the archer platform, which look like very primitive cherry picker trucks. Right. My question is, why did the Huns construct these unique engines? Is there any evidence why, or do scholars have any theories? Did they have insufficient resources to construct regular siege towers and catapults? Did the Huns want to bring their strength of arrows, storms to bear, or were the Huns just unique? Thank you for taking the time to read this. I really enjoyed the last issue and look forward to the next. Thanks, Robert. Right. Well, in the first instance, I think, yes, the Huns are unique and they are doing things their own way. Big issues there with the way that the sources refer to them, that, that they're glued to their horses, they're useless walking, they don't have infantry, which is all silly. And, the Roman sources love talking about the misshapen heads of the Huns because they involved their young people or their aristocratic young people in skull elongation, which the Roman sources can't understand at all. Now, the other thing, of course, is that the Huns, or parts of the Huns, invade with the Goths in the late 4th century AD. We've got some evidence of Hunnic incursions in the 4th century and into the 5th, so much so that by the time of the Siege of Naissus in the 440s, they've had experience of Roman warfare. They've got diplomatic relations between the Hunnic kings and both courts, East and West. And earlier in his career, Aetius is, going in and hiring Hunnic armies to come and fight for him. So the chance that there's a transfer of knowledge is possible. One of the things, of course, that Ammianus talks about is that the Goths, and therefore the Huns included in that, don't attack walls. They don't besiege cities because they don't have the knowledge or the technology to be able to take cities. But what Attila shows in firstly the Siege of Naissus, which is the first siege that we know of that he does, and then later in his Siege of Orleans, and then the taking of Milan and Aquileia in 452, he's successful at taking cities. And so that sort of suggests that the Huns learned somewhere where to take cities. Now, the evidence we have of the Siege of Naissus, however, describes these unique siege engines. And Priscus tells us about these engines. Now, there's an issue because, of course, Priscus is criticized by a lot of modern historians as being a bad source, that he's making stuff up, he's copying Thucydides, he's copying Dexippus, But for me, it's more that perhaps he's styling himself after those, but the content of what he says doesn't copy them. And in fact, he describes a unique Hunnic siege engine. And so why shouldn't we take him at his word? As you point out in your question, indeed, the description of these Hunnic siege engines is peculiar. So Priscus describes beams laid on wheels, and on these were mounted plated willow and rawhide screens to protect the archers standing on the beams who shot arrows at the defenders on the ramparts. So the screens protected the archers from the defenders' missiles and any incendiary devices, and men stationed at the other end of the beam pushed them forward on their wheels to where they were needed. So this sort of seems to describe a platform with wheels and then a beam. And at one end of the beam, you have the platform for archers, and at the other end of the beam, you've got the men pushing it. And that's what I attempted to have drawn in the centerfold of the article. So that's why you get this peculiar description of a siege engine which doesn't look like any other siege engine. It does look, and it has been drawn like a medieval trebuchet, but there's not that idea of the counterbalance that you get in the trebuchet. It also isn't a siege tower the way that siege towers are described in Polybius and other sources. And so it is this unique archer platform. We don't know how many archers there are on the beam. I think in the centerfold I chose 2, but it could be more. We don't know. There have been several other reconstructions of these which do look more medieval in my mind, or even vertical, and I don't think they match the description by Priscus. But it very much is this is what the source tells us. Here's a visual interpretation of that source. But of course, someone could come up with another one that's a different interpretation. Now, at the same time, he talks about rams. Now, the rams that he describes of the Huns seem to be much more similar to rams that we know from other siege descriptions in other sources. These were constructed of beams inclining towards one another, loose chains hanging down onto which another beam, the ram, was fastened, something like an A-frame. That, and then it would be swung back and forward on that loose chain at a point on the wall. That seems to be a far more usual description of a ram, but he says that similar to the archery beams, the rams had protective screens to stop incendiary and missile attacks from reaching the operators. There also seem to be spearheads projecting from the frame to stop people getting too close to attack. So these are the descriptions of the siege engines of the Huns, and indeed they are unique. They don't match any known siege engine, a little bit like some of the siege engines described and shown on Trajan's column, that they're not known previously, and so they seem to be unique, which is entirely plausible and entirely acceptable. So I think they are unique. I think that the Huns have perhaps learned from the Romans, but they've also put their own spin on the siege engine, knowing that they have strength in archery, knowing that they have, overwhelming numbers. Problem with the Huns is that the only one source names a number for the Huns, and that's 500,000, and that's to do with the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451. That's the only time we get a number mentioned for the Huns. So normally there's just a horde, and so we need to assume that they are a lot, which is not very useful for us when we're trying to work out how many. But if they're all archers, then having a platform that allows them to shoot onto or from above a Roman wall makes sense, and then allows the Hunnic rams to be brought against those walls. That makes a lot of sense. I think, some of the scholars are, it's lies, it's all made up. The Huns didn't take cities, but we know the Huns did take cities. These ones are explicitly taken. And so it's like, well, clearly they must have taken them some way. And we have a description which seems to tell us this is how they did it. Why would you reject that? Especially when you don't have anything to put in its place. And I think you're right. Did the Huns want to bring their strengths of arrow storms to bear? Yes. So we don't get stories of Hunnic siege towers or Hunnic catapults. We do get evidence of large loads of stone being thrown against these siege engines by the defenders of Naissus. So there are Roman defensive measures that are those. We don't get any counterweights or pulleys. It seems to be a very basic design of a frame with a beam that has the archers are presumably the counterweight of the archers as the men at the other end of that beam pushing it. So I think it's a fascinating description, but I think it's definitely one that I think we can rely on. I don't think Priscus is taking us for a ride there. I think it's an accurate description of a unique Hunnic siege weapon. thanks for your question, Robert, and join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers.